Two men closed in on Princess Charlotte in broad daylight. Hidden blades practiced movements only seconds from the gate. At 10 years old, she knew screaming wouldn't save her, not with hundreds of tourists around and the band's drums drowning out every sound. So, she did something else. Something every child is taught in school, but praised never to use. She raised her hand and gave the silent signal that means just one thing: help me. Guardsman Edward Hale saw it. And in that instant, 3 centuries of unbroken protocol meant nothing compared to a child's plea. But how did a single hand gesture force a royal guard to abandon his post? And what happened when those kidnappers realized their perfect plan had just been shattered by a girl who refused to be a victim? Before we show you exactly what unfolded in those terrifying minutes, make sure you're subscribed to our channel, Crown Guard, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The forecourt of Buckingham Palace breathes differently than anywhere else in London. Even on the busiest afternoons, and the city beyond the black iron gates thrums with double-decker buses and taxi horns, the ancient cobblestones seem to absorb sound rather than echo it. The cream-colored stone catches afternoon sunlight and holds it, bathing everything in the kind of golden glow that makes tourists pause mid-conversation and reach for their cameras without quite knowing why. Today, the light was particularly generous. It pulled around the gilded crests above the main gates, bounced off the polished brass fittings, and made the scarlet tunics of the guards burn like beacons against the pale backdrop. From somewhere beyond the main courtyard, the regimental band was warming up. French horns called back and forth across the square in deep, resonant notes that seemed to rise from the stones themselves. The barriers were already 3 deep with visitors. Germans with expensive cameras and detailed itineraries. American families clutching guidebooks and checking phones for the perfect angle. A group of Japanese tourists had stationed themselves at the prime viewing spot and weren't budging until the last note of the ceremony faded. Everyone pressed forward with that peculiar mix of excitement and reverence you only see at places where history isn't just remembered, but actively performed. Boot heels struck cobblestones in perfect unison somewhere behind the gates. The sound was sharp and purposeful, building towards something magnificent. The tourists leaned forward instinctively, phones rising like offerings to capture whatever was about to emerge from the palace depths. But not everyone was pressed against the public barriers. Off to one side, separated by a length of polished chain and the quiet presence of 2 men in dark suits, a much smaller group occupied what most visitors never even noticed. A reserved section where no tour guides pointed and no cameras intruded without permission. At the center of this protected space stood a girl who looked like she'd walked straight out of a portrait gallery, 10 years old. Her features already showed the sharp clarity that marked her as unmistakably royal. Her pale blue coat was perfectly pressed. Her shoes reflected the afternoon light with mirror brightness, and her dark hair was arranged with the kind of precision that suggested serious adult attention to detail. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her, not fidgeting like most children her age might have done, but watching the guards with intense concentration. Her gaze tracked their movements, studied their positioning, and analyzed their bearing with the focused attention of someone who understood she was witnessing something important rather than merely entertaining. Princess Charlotte of Wales. The cameras pointed elsewhere out of respect, but everyone who knew how to look recognized her immediately. Guardsman Edward Hale registered her presence without turning his head or shifting his stance. At 31, he was older than many of the soldiers who rotated through ceremonial duties, and his bearing showed it. The bear skin hat that crowned his already tall frame cast his face in shadow, but beneath that shadow lay eyes that missed nothing. Afghanistan had given him those eyes. 2 tours in Helmand province had burned into him the survival habit of watching crowds, measuring distances, and reading the subtle signals that separated ordinary behavior from potential threat. Where other people saw tourists admiring pageantry, Hale noticed the man who checked exits instead of taking photos, the woman whose gaze tracked guard movements rather than soaking up the spectacle, His left knee ached faintly where shrapnel had found its mark during his final patrol, the injury that had eventually brought him home and into the scarlet tunic of ceremonial duty. Some of his mates had seen the assignment as a step down from active combat. Hale had understood it differently. The threat environment had changed, not disappeared. Here in the heart of London, vigilance was still survival. Standing motionless for hours was its own kind of endurance test, but Hale had learned to use the stillness productively. His eyes worked constantly beneath the shadow of the bare skin, cataloging faces, tracking patterns, noting the small inconsistencies that might matter when they mattered most. And right now, something was setting off every alarm bell his training had installed. Two men stood near the edge of the crowd, close enough to the royal section to matter. From a distance, they looked like any other sightseers. Casual jackets, unremarkable trousers, cameras hanging from their necks like props in a tourist costume, but their eyes weren't following the bright scarlet tunics or admiring the ceremony's precision. They were working. One scanned the positioning of guards with mechanical thoroughness. The other studied the flow of people toward the gates, his head turning with the calculated precision of someone mapping routes rather than enjoying the view. Between them, something that looked like a tourist pamphlet changed hands, but the way it was folded, the brief flash of handwriting across its surface, suggested it contained information that had nothing to do with London's historic attractions. Hale's grip on his rifle stock tightened almost imperceptibly. The weapon, ceremonial though it appeared, was fully functional, and his muscle memory knew exactly how quickly it could become something more than ornamental. But protocol kept his boots locked to the ancient stone, until he had more than suspicion, until he could prove rather than simply sense danger. His duty was to remain exactly where tradition had placed him. The taller of the two men shifted position, moving closer to the chain that separated the public from the royal viewing area. His movement was smooth, casual, the kind of adjustment a tourist might make to get a better photograph. But tourists didn't move with that kind of controlled economy. Tourists didn't keep their elbows tight to their sides to avoid displaying the outline of objects concealed beneath their jackets. Princess Charlotte's governess leaned down to say something to her charge, adjusting the girl's coat against the afternoon breeze. Charlotte nodded politely, her attention still fixed on the guards, her young face serious with concentration. She was learning, Hale realized. This wasn't entertainment for her. It was education in the weight of tradition, the meaning of duty, the price of service. The second man had moved as well, positioning himself on the opposite side of the royal section's perimeter. They formed a bracket close enough to the chain barrier to matter, far enough from the obvious security presence to avoid immediate attention. Their timing was careful, their positioning deliberate, and then Hale saw the glint. It lasted only a fraction of a second, sunlight catching steel as the taller man's jacket shifted. A blade small enough to conceal, but large enough to matter, disappeared back beneath the cover of casual clothing. The movement was practiced, professional, the kind of concealment that spoke of experience with weapons and the violence they enabled. Hale's pulse remained steady, but internally he was already calculating angles, distances, response times. His ceremonial stillness had become a combat posture. His awareness sharpened to the crystalline focus that had kept him alive in places where hesitation meant death. The band's warm-up crescendoed into something approaching the opening notes of the ceremony, and the crowd's attention turned fully toward the palace entrance, where the first guards would soon appear. In that moment of distraction, the two men moved with a synchronized precision that confirmed Hale's worst suspicions. This wasn't random. This wasn't opportunistic. This was planned. The shorter man bumped into the governess with clumsy politeness, murmuring apologies that looked harmless. But Hale noticed the move. It turned her away from Princess Charlotte, blocking her line of sight. At the same moment, a taller man closed the distance to the girl, leaning in with a smile aimed at the cameras, but his posture was wrong. Too tense, too controlled. From where Hale stood, he saw the truth. A knife pressed against Charlotte's ribs, hidden from the crowd. Charlotte stiffened, her composure cracking, eyes wide with fear. To outsiders, it looked like two adults guiding a child, but their predatory focus betrayed them. The second man slipped in at her other side, sealing the trap. The governess turned back, frowning in confusion. But the taller man soothed her with a calm voice, suggesting they find a quieter spot. Step by step, they edged Charlotte toward the gate, where Hale glimpsed a dark vehicle idling, engine running. The girl understood. Screaming meant instant violence. Instead, she used what she had been taught. As they passed Hale, she brushed her hair back, but her fingers folded deliberately into the universal distress signal. Thumb tucked, fingers closing. "Help me." Recognition struck Hale like a blow. 3 centuries of tradition chained him to his post. Guards never broke formation. But a child's silent plea outweighed ceremony. The crack of his boots on cobblestone silenced the courtyard. Tourists gasped, cameras swung, the band faltered. No guardsman had ever abandoned position. Until now. Scarlet tunic blazing, rifle angled with purpose, Hale advanced. His voice thundered, "Release her now." The taller man froze, knife shifting, mask slipping. "Keep walking," he hissed to Charlotte. But she stopped, trusting the soldier who had answered her call. The crowd sensed danger. Phones rose. History was being filmed in real time. Hale closed the distance in 3 strides. The man snarled, "You have no idea what you're interfering with." Walk away or she pays. Hale's hand shot forward, iron grip crushing the wrist that held the knife. A twist. The blade clattered to the stones. He pulled Charlotte behind him, rifle steady. The second kidnapper lunged, fury replacing disguise. Hale swung the rifle butt into his chest, dropping him. But the man recovered fast, throwing a punch that snapped Hale's head to the side. The guardsman answered with devastating strikes, precise, trained, unstoppable. Moments later, both attackers lay cuffed on the cobblestones, palace security swarming in to finish it. Through the chaos, Hale stood firm, shielding Charlotte. Cameras captured everything, the breaking of tradition, the saving of a princess. When silence finally settled, Charlotte looked up, gratitude replacing fear. Later, in the palace corridor, Hale gave his account. The suspicious approach, the hidden blade, and the signal Charlotte had made. "Her Royal Highness gave the universal distress signal," he concluded. "That justified my action." Officials exchanged looks, torn between protocol and the obvious truth. Then Charlotte herself stepped forward. "He did what I asked him to do. I made the signal, just like they taught us. He saw it. He came." She demonstrated it again, firm and deliberate. The matter was settled. "Inquiries will follow," Harwood told Hale. "Questions in Parliament. But you acted to protect a royal child. The regiment stands behind you." Charlotte wasn't finished. She pulled a folded paper from her pocket. A drawing, her own hand, showed a guardsman shielding a small figure in a blue coat. Beneath, in careful script, "Thank you for seeing my signal." The soldier who had faced knives without flinching felt his throat tighten. Charlotte only said, "You listened." That's what mattered that evening. Hale pinned the drawing above his bed, beside medals and photos of fallen comrades. A text from his sister arrived. Dad would have been proud. His father had worn the same uniform decades earlier, and Hale knew. The old man would have understood. A week later, Charlotte returned to Buckingham Palace. She watched the guards with calm confidence, fear replaced by trust. Hale stood immovable in his post, just another scarlet figure to the crowd. But when their eyes met, Charlotte touched her chest, a small gesture of recognition. Hale gave the slightest nod. Protocol intact, but meaning exchanged. The band played on, the pageantry continued, but everyone there knew they had witnessed something greater than ceremony. Sometimes the highest duty is not obedience to tradition, but the courage to break it. So I'll ask you, if you saw that signal, would you have recognized it? Would you have acted? Courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a child's hand signal. Sometimes it's a guardsman breaking centuries of silence. If this story moved you, like the video and tell us where you're watching from. Subscribe so you never miss the next story, because courage takes many forms, and the next Royal Guard story is waiting for you.